Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
You know the whole Meghan Markle and the media thing?
Oh, yeah.
It never seems to end, does it?
Never.
So specifically today, we're looking at her Vanity Fair cover story from back in 2017.
Right.
And what's cool is we've got some great sources for this one.
Yeah, for sure.
So first, we've got Graydon Carter himself.
Wow, interesting.
Right. He was the editor for Vanity Fair back then.
Well,
So
we're in the thick of it.
exactly.
Wow.
And then we also have this really insightful episode from the Royal Insights podcast.
I love that one.
Me too. It's really good. They had the host, Emma, of course, and then this royal expert, James Collins,
I know him. Yeah.
and also a media journalist named Rebecca Hayes.
Okay, cool.
So a really good mix of perspectives to unpack here.
Definitely.
And what we're really trying to do in this deep dive is, I guess, get to the heart of what Meghan was going through around that time.
Yeah, like what was her experience really like with all this media attention?
Right. And what does it tell us about how fame works? Especially when you're suddenly thrown into the royal family spotlight.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Totally. And the media can be so unpredictable.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you never know what angle they're going to latch onto.
Yeah, that's true.
But what's really fascinating here, I think, is the difference between what Meghan expected from the article and what actually ended up happening.
You mean the whole Prince Harry thing?
Exactly. Like, she probably thought the article would be about her,
Makes sense.
like her career and her accomplishments.
Right.
But once the relationship with Harry became public knowledge, that became the main focus.
Okay, sure.
And Graydon Carter actually said that Meghan wasn't really on his radar until she started dating Harry.
Really?
Yeah, which is interesting because it shows you how much that royal connection just changes everything.
Oh, totally. It's like this instant boost in terms of public interest.
And media interest, too.
Yeah, right.
So James Collins mentioned this on the podcast. Apparently, when Meghan saw how much the Vanity Fair article was going to focus on Harry, she was kind of surprised.
What did she say?
She supposedly asked, is this all going to be about Prince Harry?
That's a loaded question.
It is right.
I wonder what was going through her mind at that moment.
Right. Like, was she annoyed or disappointed or...
Maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
Well, Graydon Carter seems to have interpreted it as a sign that she was kind of out of touch.
Out of touch with what?
Well, he said she was slightly adrift on the facts and reality.
Okay, that's harsh.
I know, right?
But what do you think he meant by that?
I think he was implying that she maybe underestimated how much the public would be interested in her relationship with Harry.
As opposed to
her acting career or her humanitarian work or whatever else she might have wanted to talk about.
Yeah, like her own individual achievements.
Right.
It's like he's saying that she didn't quite grasp the priorities of a mainstream publication like Vanity Fair.
Especially at that moment.
Exactly, like the royal romance was the hot topic.
It was huge.
And it's understandable that Meghan might have seen things differently.
Oh, for sure.
Like, she was probably thinking, I'm an accomplished woman with my own story to tell.
Right, like I'm more than just Prince Harry's girlfriend.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because Rebecca Hayes, the media journalist on the podcast,
Yeah.
she brings up this really important point about how hard it is for celebrities to control their own narrative.
Oh, especially when royalty is involved.
That's like a whole other level.
Right.
She says there's this constant tension between what celebrities want to project and what the public is actually interested in.
And the media obviously plays a huge role in shaping that.
Absolutely.
And when it comes to the royal family, the media just goes into overdrive.
Totally.
Like, everything gets magnified.
It's like they're under a microscope.
Yeah, and any little thing can become a huge story.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So for Meghan to think that she could just control the narrative of her Vanity Fair cover...
Especially with the Harry connection.
Right.
It's probably a bit unrealistic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Rebecca Hayes basically says that once you enter the royal sphere, you lose a lot of control over your image.
It makes sense, though, right?
In a way,
Like,
yeah.
the public interest is just so intense.
And the media feeds off of that.
Exactly.
Now, this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, tell me.
So, James Collins brought up this parallel between Meghan and Princess Diana,
Interesting.
and he linked this back to something Graydon Carter said.
Okay.
Apparently, Carter mentioned that Diana was really fascinated by powerful families.
Oh, like the Kennedys?
Exactly. He specifically said that she was curious about how Jackie Kennedy navigated life with the Kennedys.
That's thought-provoking.
It is right.
Like, what do you think Diana saw in Jackie's story?
Well, I think she recognized the challenges of being a woman within those kinds of powerful institutions.
Yeah, like the constant scrutiny and the pressure to conform.
And maybe even a sense of losing your own identity.
Or your own voice.
right? Like you become this symbol or this figurehead, and people forget that you're a real person with your own thoughts and feelings.
It's like you're playing a role rather than living your own life.
Exactly.
And I think what Carter is suggesting is that Diana saw a bit of herself in Jackie.
Like they both had to deal with this unique set of pressures that most people can't even imagine.
Right, and they both had to find ways to cope with that.
And it makes you wonder if Meghan felt that same kind of connection to Diana.
Oh, definitely. Like she was walking in Diana's footsteps in a way.
But then Carter goes even further and says that Diana would be heartbroken about the current rift between Harry and the royal family.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is.
And I think it suggests that he sees a pattern here.
Like a pattern of
Powerful families struggling with internal conflicts.
and often those conflicts involve people who married into the family.
Right, like outsiders who come in and maybe shake things up a bit.
And that can lead to tension and resentment.
And in some cases, even a complete break.
Yeah, so he's basically implying that what's happening with Meghan and Harry isn't totally unique.
Like it's part of a bigger story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Rebecca Hayes picks up on that idea of recurring patterns, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but she focuses more on the way royal women are portrayed in the media.
I'm sure.
She describes it as a cycle.
What kind of cycle?
Well, it starts with this initial period of intense adoration.
Like they can do no wrong.
Right, they're beautiful and glamorous, and everyone loves them.
The fairy tale princess thing.
Exactly, but then the media starts to turn on them.
Oh, so the honeymoon phase is over.
Yeah, and they become the target of all this negative attention.
Like what they wear, what they say, how they raise their kids.
Everything is scrutinized and criticized.
And social media just amplifies that whole process.
Oh, for sure. It's like a feeding frenzy.
Yeah.
And Rebecca specifically says that Meghan's experience is an echo of what Diana went through.
But magnified by social media.
Exactly. Like it's the same basic pattern, but on steroids.
It must be incredibly overwhelming to be on the receiving end of that.
I can't even imagine.
So it makes you wonder, was Meghan right to be frustrated about that Vanity Fair cover?
Good question.
Like, was it fair for her to expect something different given the circumstances?
Yeah, and James Collins actually addresses that directly.
What does he say?
He says that on the one hand, it's totally valid for Meghan to want recognition for her own accomplishments.
Yet she had a career before Harry.
Right, and she was involved in all sorts of things.
So it's understandable that she wouldn't want to be defined solely by her relationship.
But on the other hand, he says you can't ignore the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it is.
Which is that dating a prince puts you in a whole different category.
Like you become a global news story.
Exactly. And the media is going to be primarily interested in that royal connection.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Rebecca Hayes adds to that by saying that no one connected to the royal family can really control the media narrative.
It's just too powerful.
Right, like the level of public interest is so huge that it's almost impossible to steer the conversation in your own direction.
So even if Meghan had tried to make the Vanity Fair article more about her own work,
it probably wouldn't have made much of a difference.
the headlines would still be about Harry.
Exactly. And that brings us to this really interesting question that Rebecca Hayes kind of poses.
Okay, I'm curious.
She asks whether Meghan and Harry can ever truly reshape their public narrative.
Now that they've stepped back from their royal roles,
Right.
that's a tough one.
It is, because even though they're not working royals anymore,
The world is still obsessed with them,
totally. So the media attention hasn't really gone away.
and it probably never will.
Maybe not.
So even if they want to focus on their own projects and their own causes,
See you soon for the next
the
part.
Harry and Meghan narrative is always going to be there.
Like this underlying current.
It's like they can't escape it.
And that's what makes this whole story so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's all about this clash between expectations and reality.
Like what Meghan hoped for versus what actually happened.
Right, and it highlights this fundamental tension that exists for anyone who enters the royal family.
Especially women, it seems.
Oh, for sure.
And it makes you wonder, like, what could be done to change things?
Right, like how can we avoid repeating these same patterns with future royal couples?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It is, but it's definitely something worth thinking about.
Yeah, for sure.
Because ultimately, it's about respecting people's individuality.
And not just reducing them to their royal connections.
Exactly.
It's a challenge for the media, for the public,
Yeah.
and for the royal family itself.
So much to unpack.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Thanks for diving into this with me today.
Of course, always a pleasure.
Until next time.